There are moments in a person's life that arrive without warning, a single sentence spoken in a cold conference room, a cardboard box carried out through a side door, an elevator ride down that feels nothing like the ones before it. These moments are not the end of anything, though they feel that way with a completeness that is almost physical, a weight in the chest, a dull pressure behind the eyes that has nothing to do with tears, and everything to do with the collapse of something you had not realized you were depending on so entirely. Sometimes, they are the exact beginning the universe intended all along, dressed in the cruelest disguise imaginable, wrapped in the language of dismissal and the cold bureaucratic finality of human resources paperwork. Jordan Price knew nothing of that on the morning he walked into Harrison Industries, with a rolled-up set of blueprints under his arm, and a quiet, unshakable belief that what he was carrying could save the company that had employed him for over a decade. He did not know that by afternoon, he would be carrying a cardboard box instead. He did not know that the woman sitting at the head of that conference table would, in a matter of minutes, utter the 4 words that would rewire the entire trajectory of his life. He only knew that he had solved the problem. He only knew that he was right. Jordan Price was 38 years old and had spent the better part of his adult life inside factories. Not as a floor worker, though he had done that too in his early 20s, mopping up oil and learning the machines the way a musician learns an instrument, not from manuals alone, but from feel, from sound, from intuition built through thousands of hours of quiet attention to how things moved and where they failed and what they needed in order to do what they were designed to do. He had gone to night school while working the floor, earning his mechanical engineering degree 1 class at a time over 6 years, never missing a single shift, never asking for recognition or accommodation, or the kind of small adjustments that would have made his life marginally easier. He did not ask because he did not think it was appropriate to ask, and also because asking was simply not something he was built for in that particular way. By the time he had the degree in hand, he had already solved 3 production bottlenecks that the senior engineering team had been circling for months, and the solutions had been implemented without ceremony, attributed generally to the department rather than to him specifically, and he had not minded. He was not the kind of man who announced himself. He was the kind of man whose work announced him. And even then, he didn't need the announcement. He just needed the problem to be fixed. Harrison Industries had been his professional home for 11 years. In that time, he had filed 9 patents, all of them assigned to the company per his employment contract, a clause he had signed without argument because he genuinely believed in what they were building together and had not yet arrived at the understanding that belief, however sincere, does not always travel in both directions. He had redesigned the secondary assembly line in the eastern plant, cutting waste by 31% in a single quarter. He had developed a vibration dampening mechanism for the precision milling units that had since been quietly adopted by 3 of Harrison's competitors, who had reverse engineered it with varying degrees of success. He had never complained about the lack of credit. He had never asked for a corner office or a vice presidential title, or any of the visible markers by which organizations signal that a person's contributions have been weighed and found significant. He had asked, once, for a small raise to cover the cost of a specialist his daughter needed after a difficult winter. And he had received it without trouble, which he considered fair and did not complain about. He was not a man who wanted much. He was a man who wanted to work, to solve things, and to go home to his daughter. Emma Price was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes green and steady, with a quality of calm attention that made adults feel genuinely seen when she looked at them, as though whatever she was observing was worth the full expenditure of her considerable focus. Her mother, Diane, had passed away 18 months before from a rapid and merciless form of cancer that had announced itself in January and taken her by September, which was not enough time for anyone to adjust to the idea that she was actually leaving. Though there had been no absence of warning, only an absence of belief, which is a different thing. Jordan had taken 2 weeks of bereavement leave, arranged for a neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, to watch Emma after school, and returned to work. Not because he had stopped grieving, he carried the grief the way you carry a stone in your pocket, always present, varying in weight depending on the hour, but because grief and responsibility were not things he could separate. And the responsibility part required a paycheck and the presence of mind to earn one. He rose at 5:30 every morning, made Emma's lunch, braided her hair with a clumsiness he was slowly and determinedly improving, drove her to school, drove to the plant, worked through lunch more often than not, and returned home in time to cook something real, not microwave food. Diane had been clear about that, and the clarity of it had survived her, and sit at the kitchen table while Emma did her homework, and told him about the things that had happened to her that day, with the thoroughness of someone filing a complete and accurate report for an audience she trusted entirely. He loved those evenings. They were the center of his life, the fixed point around which the rest of it organized itself. Emma had started leaving little drawings on his workbench, in the garage rockets, bridges, machines she invented with the unguarded imagination of a 7-year-old who had decided her father built important things, and therefore important things deserved more of them. She drew him as a giant in some of the pictures, not literally, but in the way children convey importance, with size and placement, and the particular emphasis of crayon applied with conviction. She always drew herself standing right beside him, equally large, equally significant. In one drawing, they were operating a machine together that appeared to be part crane, part telescope, and part something with no category yet in existence, which Emma explained to him at length one Saturday morning while he drank his coffee, and listened with complete attention, and, which he later realized, bore a striking conceptual resemblance to a robotic arm configuration he had been trying to solve on paper for 3 weeks. He did not mention this to her, partly because she was 7, and partly because he genuinely believed she had arrived at it independently through the same kind of spatial reasoning that he had been cultivating since his own childhood, and that this was not coincidence but inheritance, the specific transmission of a particular kind of mind across a generation. Jordan kept every drawing in a folder tucked behind the technical manuals on the shelf above his workbench, and on the nights he stayed up late working through a problem that wouldn't yield. Those drawings were what he looked at when the difficulty felt like it might be permanent, because they reminded him that permanence was not, in his experience, a property that difficulty actually possessed. The crisis at Harrison Industries had begun 6 weeks before Jordan's meeting with Victoria. A flaw in the magnetic calibration system of the new CX-7 production line had begun producing parts that were microscopically out of tolerance, invisible to standard inspection protocols, but catastrophic in the field, where precision components operate in conditions that magnify small errors into large failures with impressive reliability. 3 major clients had reported failures in the field. 2 contracts totaling nearly $4 million were under active threat of cancellation, and the engineering team had been working around the clock through a succession of failed hypotheses, each one generating a new investigation that produced a new dead end. The proposed solution from the senior leadership, after 3 weeks of analysis and 2 rounds of consulting recommendations, involved replacing the entire calibration subsystem at a cost of $840,000 and a production shutdown of 3 weeks. Jordan had attended the technical briefings, said nothing in the meetings, and gone home to think. He had stood in his garage for 2 nights, with the specifications spread across a folding table under the single overhead light, working through the problem with the particular kind of quiet concentration that excludes everything except the thing itself. And by the 3rd night, he understood what no one else had seen. The problem was not the calibration hardware at all. The problem was a feedback loop in the software interface that was compounding a minor thermal drift during the first 40 minutes of each production run, a drift so small that it fell within acceptable parameters individually, but accumulated into an unacceptable deviation when the feedback loop ran its correction cycle at the wrong phase of the thermal curve. The hardware was fine. The fix required a firmware patch and a reconfiguration of the sensor array, a repair that would cost roughly $84,000 and take 4 days from start to sign-off. He wrote it all out, drew the diagrams, checked the math 3 times against the original specifications, and asked his supervisor, Marcus Webb, a good and technically literate man who had hired Jordan years before and had always understood, without requiring it to be explained, what Jordan was actually worth to the department, whether he could present it directly to the executive team. Marcus read the proposal, went quiet for a long moment, with the expression of a person running internal calculations, and said, "Jordan, I think you need to be in that room." He walked into the conference room on the 14th floor, with his rolled blueprints and a calm heart, the particular calm of someone who has done the work, and trusts the work, and understands that the quality of the argument is in the specifications, not in the delivery. The room was full 6 senior engineers, the VP of Operations, the Chief Technology Officer, and at the head of the table, Victoria Harrison. Victoria Harrison was 32 years old and had taken the helm of her family's company 14 months earlier following her father's retirement. She held an MBA from a prestigious institution and had spent 4 years at a global consulting firm before returning to what she considered her rightful position at the company her family had built. She was sharp and genuinely intelligent in certain ways, fluent in the language of strategy decks and quarterly projections and stakeholder alignment, and the kind of organizational restructuring that looks efficient in a PowerPoint and sometimes also is. She had strong opinions about efficiency and had spent much of her first year restructuring departments, cutting what she called legacy redundancies, and bringing in outside consultants at significant expense to validate decisions she had already made. She wore confidence the way some people wear expensive clothes, visibly and with intention, as both armor and announcement. She was not a person who suffered doubt publicly, and she was not, in any deep experiential sense, a person who had spent time on a factory floor learning what floor time teaches. Jordan laid out his diagrams on the conference table and began to explain. He walked through the thermal drift, the feedback loop, the accumulation of error over the production cycle, the precise nature of the firmware correction required. He showed the cost comparison, $84,000 against $840,000, a 10-to-1 ratio in favor of the solution that had come not from the consulting engagement, but from 11 years of attention to how the machines actually behaved. The senior engineers around the table had leaned forward progressively as he spoke. The CTO made a sound that contained the beginning of the word remarkable before he arrested it, perhaps sensing the temperature of the room from the head of the table. Marcus Webb nodded steadily from across the table, with the expression of a man watching something he believed in be confirmed in public. Jordan concluded his presentation and looked up at Victoria. She had been looking at her tablet for the final 3 minutes of his presentation. She set the tablet down and looked at him with the patient expression of someone who has allocated a fixed amount of attention to a situation and reached the end of that allocation. "You're Jordan Price," she said. It was not quite a question, more the verbal equivalent of placing a file on a desk you already know the contents of. Mid-level mechanical team. Jordan said quietly that he was a senior mechanical engineer, which was accurate. She acknowledged this without revision, and then did something that only made sense if you understood her particular framework. She looked at the diagrams on the table, not for long, and then she looked back at him, and her expression moved from patient to decided. "This is technically interesting," she said. "But decisions at this scale involve strategic considerations that extend well beyond the technical dimension. We have consultants reviewing this situation who bring a broader organizational perspective to bear." Jordan said, carefully, that the consultants had not identified the root cause, and that the proposal on the table solved the problem at 10% of the proposed cost. And he said it without heat, simply as a statement of fact that he believed the room should have available to it when it made its decision. Victoria Harrison heard him. She simply placed his words in a category that her framework had already decided was not authoritative. She said, "I appreciate the work, but I think this is an example of a problem that's larger than what an individual contributor at your level can fully assess." There was a pause, the kind that functions as a preliminary. Then she said, with the smooth executive finality that carries no cruelty in tone but contains it entirely in substance, "Jordan Price, you've been with this company a long time. And to be direct, you represent exactly the kind of resource structure we're moving away from. Your thinking is competent, but it's not where the company needs to be going forward. We're letting you go, effective immediately. HR will handle the transition details." The room went profoundly still. The CTO opened his mouth. Marcus Webb's face went the particular color that faces go when a person is witnessing an injustice they have no power to prevent and know it. 2 of the senior engineers exchanged a glance across the table that held an entire conversation in it. A conversation that would never be spoken aloud in that building. Jordan stood for a moment, without moving, then rolled his blueprints back into their tube with the same careful, unhurried movements he used for everything. Thanked the room in a voice that did not shake, or thin, or compress, and walked out. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 11 minutes. He was not crying. He was doing something quieter, absorbing the shape of what had happened, mapping it against what he knew about himself and what he intended his life to be. And arriving, by the end of 11 minutes, at a conclusion that felt less like a decision and more like a recognition. He thought about Emma and the school schedule and Mrs. Calloway's availability. He thought about the mortgage payment due in 18 days, the specialist appointment he had scheduled for the following month, the small savings account he had been building, with deliberate patience toward Emma's education. He thought about the 9 patents with his name on them that now legally belonged to someone else, and he considered how he felt about that, and he found that what he felt was not rage. He had expected rage, had braced for it, and it had not arrived. What had arrived instead was something more like clarity, the kind that comes when an external structure you had been organizing yourself around is removed, and you discover, in the sudden absence of it, that your actual shape is different from what you had been assuming. He thought, "They have my patents. They don't have what made the patents." And he started the car and drove to pick up his daughter. He picked Emma up from school that afternoon without explaining what had happened, and listened to her describe a design she had made for a crane that could also function as a submarine, a project she was deeply invested in for reasons of her own that she explained at length and with conviction. After dinner, she found him sitting at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his gaze somewhere past the wall, and she climbed into the chair beside him and took his hand in both of hers and said simply, "Something happened." He told her the truth. She was quiet for the duration of a full breath, considering it with those green eyes, and then asked if he was going to find a new job. He looked at her and said he thought he was going to make one instead. She nodded once, with the gravity of someone accepting a serious and reasonable proposal. "Good," she said. "You're better at making things than finding them anyway." The garage light went on that same night, and did not go off until nearly 3 in the morning, and when it came on again at 5:15, there was already something new beginning on the workbench. Not a finished thing, not even a well-formed idea yet, but the particular quality of marks on paper that a person makes when they are no longer planning and have started doing, when the future has shifted from a question into a project. The neighbors noticed the light but said nothing. Mrs. Calloway noticed the shadows under Jordan's eyes the next morning when she arrived to take Emma to school, and also said nothing, because she had known him since Diane was alive, and she understood that he was a person who worked through things by working, and that the kindest thing anyone could do for him in a moment like this was to handle the things he had asked her to handle, which she did with quiet and complete reliability. Jordan sold his car 2 weeks later, and replaced it with a 15-year-old pickup truck, using the difference, plus a carefully documented bank loan, to lease a second-hand CNC milling machine and rent a small commercial space in an industrial strip on Mercer Road. Mrs. Calloway expanded her after-school hours. Emma contributed by not leaving her boots in the hallway, a reform she described as her household efficiency initiative. The early months were a specific and grinding kind of hard that Jordan would later describe, when asked, as the most educational period of his professional life, meaning not that it was pleasant, but that the density of what he learned per unit of time was extraordinary. His first product, a precision coupling adapter designed to solve a problem he had personally observed across multiple factory environments, took 4 prototypes to get right, and attracted zero interest from the first 7 companies he contacted. The 8th, a small fabrication shop run by Gary Kowalski, agreed to take 3 units on trial. 1 failed under stress testing. Jordan drove to the shop that evening, inspected the failure, identified the stress concentration he had underestimated at a load-bearing junction, redesigned the component over 2 nights, and delivered replacements at no charge. Gary Kowalski called him the following week to order 25 more, and the week after that, to mention the name of a colleague who was having a similar problem. There was a Tuesday night at the 4-month mark, when Jordan did the math at the kitchen table, and understood that without a significant new order within 6 weeks, He would need to close the shop. He did not tell Emma this. He made dinner, listened to her describe a trading card negotiation she had conducted with strategic nuance he found genuinely impressive, helped with long division, and said goodnight. The next morning she came downstairs and placed a small red tin on the table in front of him, her savings tin, coins and small bills accumulated since she was 5, $47 and change, and pushed it toward him without preamble. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he put it gently back in her hands, said he was going to figure it out, and drove to 3 potential clients before noon. The third, a regional equipment manufacturer called Bridgeford Parts, agreed to a trial contract. It was not enough to solve everything. It was enough to buy 6 more weeks, and he used those 6 weeks with the focused economy of a person who understands that opportunity is not infinite, and attention is the only thing that makes it yield. By the end of the first year, Price Engineering had 4 recurring clients, a second-hand laser cutting system acquired at auction for 30 cents on the dollar, and the foundational architecture of something much larger under construction in the evenings after Emma was asleep. The something larger was a robotic inspection unit, a system capable of identifying microscopic surface defects in machined components with a speed and accuracy that existing equipment on the market could not approach. Jordan worked on it with the same methodical, incremental patience he applied to every one subsystem at a time, tested against the previous one, documented with the rigor of a person who knows that a solution you cannot explain is a solution you do not yet fully own. The unit took 14 months to complete. When he demonstrated it to a mid-sized aerospace component supplier named Hartwell Precision, the VP of Quality walked around it 3 times, asked for the demonstration twice more, and signed a contract that gave Jordan the capital to build 12 production units and the time, under an exclusivity period, to build them properly. Price Engineering hired Lou Ferretti, 54 years old, laid off from a large plant when his position was automated, a machinist whose hands contained a knowledge that no automation had yet found a way to replicate the knowledge of how a material behaves under a particular kind of stress, not in the abstract sense that a textbook describes it, but in the immediate, physical sense of a person who has felt the difference between a cut that is going right and a cut that is about to go wrong, and who has developed through decades of that feeling a judgment that operates faster than calculation. It hired Dana Park, who had spent 8 years in quality control being passed over for promotion despite a track record. Jordan considered extraordinary and described to her directly upon hiring her, in specific terms, with specific examples, because he believed people deserved to know precisely when their work was exceptional, rather than receiving a vague and deniable version of the acknowledgement through the usual institutional channels. Dana had looked at him for a moment, with the careful expression of someone deciding whether to trust a thing that sounds too much like what they had been waiting to hear, and then she said simply, "When do I start?" It hired a young welder named Terrence Mills, 22 years old, no credentials beyond high school, with a spatial intuition for metalwork so developed that Jordan recognized it immediately as the same kind of faculty he had spent decades cultivating in himself, the ability to perceive a 3-dimensional object in all its relationships simultaneously, to understand before the calculation is complete how a change to one element will propagate through a system. Jordan paid all 3 above the regional average, a decision that alarmed his accountant and that he did not reverse, because he had a theory about the relationship between financial security and the quality of attention people bring to their work, and his theories, when grounded in direct observation rather than abstraction, had a reliable tendency to be correct. He explained it to Lou once, plainly. People do better work when they are not worrying about their bills, so he was going to make sure they were not worrying about their bills, and the quality of their work would more than cover the difference. The accountant came around within 2 quarters, which was the kind of proof Jordan found satisfying not because it validated him but because it meant the principle would be maintained going forward. While Price Engineering was building itself from a garage on Mercer Road into something that manufacturing people were beginning to notice, Harrison Industries was learning, at considerable expense, the things that Victoria Harrison had not understood when she dismissed a man carrying a tube of blueprints and a 10-to-1 cost advantage. She had proceeded with the $840,000 calibration replacement. It had resolved the immediate crisis, though the shutdown ran to 5 weeks instead of 3. In the aftermath, she had cut the engineering department by 30%, replacing institutional knowledge with an outsourced technical advisory arrangement that looked clean and efficient in the organizational chart and was, in daily practice, consistently slower and less accurate than what it replaced. Client retention was maintained through price concessions that squeezed margins. Technology investment was deferred once, then twice, then removed from the capital plan entirely as cash pressures mounted. The problem was not that Victoria lacked intelligence. The problem was that she was intelligent about the wrong things at the wrong time, in an industry that does not forgive the substitution of financial fluency for mechanical understanding. She understood balance sheets. She did not understand, at the level of experience that produces real understanding, that the knowledge of how to keep a production line running at peak performance is not something you can outsource or replace on a spreadsheet. It lives in the accumulated attention of experienced people, and when those people leave, they take it with them in a way that does not show up as a line item until the losses do. The losses came slowly, and then all at once, in the familiar manner of such things. 2 major clients moved their contracts to competitors whose equipment was newer and whose quality consistency was, by then, measurably superior. A third reduced its orders without formal explanation. The informal explanation being a conversation between a purchasing manager and Gary Kowalski at a regional industry gathering, in which Gary mentioned, with the quiet specificity of a satisfied customer, the name of a company that had been solving exactly the kinds of problems Harrison Industries was now producing. Skilled workers left in the quiet, demoralizing trickle that is harder to reverse than a visible crisis because it produces no single alarm moment, no event that demands response, only a gradual dimming of the place, a slow erosion of the particular quality that comes from people who know what they are doing and have been doing it long enough to know it well. The machines aged without the maintenance investment they required. The consulting budget continued to grow, even as the consulting recommendations produced diminishing returns that the consultants attributed, in their reports, to implementation challenges at the operational level. By the time the board convened an emergency session and the bank called in its covenants, the numbers told a story that had been written incrementally over 4 years and was now available only in its completed form, which made it very clear and very late. Harrison Industries filed for bankruptcy protection on a gray Thursday morning, 4.5 years after the meeting where Victoria Harrison had told Jordan Price that he had outlived his usefulness to the company his work had helped sustain. The primary asset auction attracted interest from development groups, who saw the land value rather than the industrial value, from consolidators who wanted the equipment, and from a private investment vehicle whose identity was not disclosed in advance. Victoria attended the auction in person because the factory had been in her family for 31 years, and because she felt, though she would not have described it this way to anyone who asked, that she owed it a witness. She sat in the third row with her hands folded, and her professional composure assembled with the visible effort of a person carrying more weight than the posture entirely conceals. The bidding reached 4.2 million, 4.7, 5.1, 5.9. The undisclosed investor countered at 6.4, and the room went the particular quiet of a contest that has ended. She signed the transfer documents on a Wednesday morning in a law office on the 22nd floor. She arrived early, arranged her papers, and sat with her back straight. The door opened. Jordan Price walked in, set his briefcase on the table, and looked at her without animosity or performance, with the steady directness of a man who has nothing to prove and therefore nothing to perform. The professional composure Victoria had been maintaining did not shatter. It simply became, suddenly, an enormous amount of work to maintain. She managed his name. He sat down across from her and opened his briefcase. He said he was glad she could make it, and he meant it without irony, because Jordan Price was not a man who trafficked in irony when the plain version of a thing would serve. She asked him why. He told her the truth, because of the people, 312 workers, who had lost their jobs when the plant closed. Families built around that place, mortgages and schedules and children's routines organized around the fact that the factory was there and would keep being there. He was not buying a building. He was buying the means to give them back what they had lost. He also noted, because honesty demanded completeness, that it was an excellent facility with good bones, and it would have been a waste to tear it down. Victoria looked at him across the table for a long moment, and the composure cracked, not with tears, not yet, but in the manner that composure cracks when it encounters something it cannot argue with or dismiss or restructure into something more manageable. She said she did not know what to say to him. He told her she didn't need to say anything. Sign the documents. They would get on with it. The rehiring began within the week. Jordan and Dana personally oversaw the outreach to former Harrison employees, prioritizing the longest tenured and those whose dismissals had come not from performance issues, but from the layoffs and closures that had accompanied the company's decline. They called people at home. They drove to some of them. A few of those calls were long and careful, because the people who answered had been through the particular experience of being told that they and their work were no longer needed, and that experience does not simply clear when the phone rings with a different message. It requires a kind of patient, specific reassurance that is different from a general announcement of positive intentions. Jordan provided it personally wherever possible, because he understood that experience from the inside, and because the people he was calling deserved to be spoken to by someone who meant what he was saying in a way that was also personally verifiable. Of the 312 who had been let go in the final months of Harrison Industries, 219 eventually came back through the doors of what was now the Harrison campus of Price Technologies. They came back to upgraded equipment. The first capital expenditure Jordan had approved was a comprehensive machinery investment that brought every production line to current standards, a decision he had made before the sale was complete and budgeted for, before the financing was closed, because he considered it a precondition of the undertaking rather than an optional enhancement. They came back to a training program Dana had designed with the specific goal of building skills rather than merely filling positions, offering certifications, advancement tracks, and partnerships with 2 regional technical colleges that placed graduating students into paid apprenticeships on the campus floor. They came back to wages above the regional average, to a profit-sharing structure that distributed a meaningful portion of campus performance back to the people producing it, and to a management philosophy premised on the straightforward and frequently underestimated idea that the people closest to the machines generally have the most accurate understanding of what those machines need, and that this understanding should be solicited, recorded, acted upon, and credited accordingly. The productivity data from the first year of operation was striking enough to attract the attention of a manufacturing trade journal. 38% increase in throughput, 44% reduction in defect rates, turnover at 4% in a sector where 11 was considered strong performance. 3 former Harrison clients returned. 2 new ones came directly from the article. Victoria Harrison spent the year after the bankruptcy in what she would later describe as an enforced education reading. Not about how to lead, but about what people actually know and where they know it from, and what is lost when an organization decides that the people who know things from experience are less valuable than the people who know things from credentials. She attended an industry conference and sat in the back row, while a panelist discussed manufacturing culture and the retention of technical knowledge with an authority she could not argue with, and looked at the program to identify the speaker, and found the name Jordan Price, Chief Executive Officer, Price Technologies. She sat with the program in her hands for a long time. The meeting she requested came 6 months later. She drove herself, waited in the lobby, and was shown into an office that was not what she expected. It was a working space, with schematics and a whiteboard and actual papers, and, on the windowsill, a folder swollen with the accumulated additions of many years. She said what she had come to say, the full version of it, without the executive register she usually inhabited, that she had dismissed him because of where he sat in the organizational chart, that she had not looked at what he actually knew, that she had said to a person who had given 11 years of genuine work that he was finished, in a room full of his colleagues, and that she had been wrong, not merely tactically wrong. Not wrong in a way that could be classified as a misalignment of strategic priorities, but genuinely, fundamentally, personally, wrong. Jordan listened to all of it. He let the silence after it be what it was. Then he said he wanted to tell her something, and he told her the truth that he had carried for years. If she had not fired him that day, he would still be working in that building, solving problems and filing patents in the company's name, and retiring with a reasonable pension and a genuine sense of having contributed. That was not a bad life. But it was not this. What she had done was one of the worst things that had happened to him since his wife died, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. But it was also the thing that made him build what he had built. And he could not separate those two truths from each other, because they were the same event. Victoria said, "You're telling me my worst moment contributed to your best outcome." Jordan said both things were true at the same time, which was usually how it went, and that he didn't carry what had happened as a debt she owed him. She had made a bad call. People did. What mattered was what you did with what you had learned from it. She asked how he was not angrier. He told her he had been angry for a while, but that anger doesn't run machines or design systems or help you understand a thermal feedback loop at 2 in the morning. It just burns energy you don't have to spare. He had a daughter. He had decided what he was going to spend his energy on. They shook hands at the end of the conversation, not the formal handshake of a closing, but the more deliberate kind exchanged between people who have acknowledged something real about the past and chosen together to leave it there. Price Technologies expanded in the years that followed, in the way things expand when they are built on an actual foundation, not suddenly or dramatically, not with the explosive quality of something that has been leveraged into a shape larger than its substance, but steadily, and with the particular quality of growth that produces something durable rather than something merely impressive. The Harrison campus added a 4th production building, then a research and development wing, where Dana and a team of 12 engineers worked on the 2nd generation of the AI optimization system. An apprenticeship center partnered with 4 regional technical high schools, putting graduating students into paid training positions that converted to full employment at a rate that the schools found remarkable and talked about at every enrollment event they hosted. Jordan funded 2 scholarships at the engineering college, where he had gotten his own degree, named not for himself but for Emma, because she was the reason he had kept going during the worst of it, and because he wanted the name on those scholarships to belong to someone who was still becoming something, rather than someone who had already arrived. Emma enrolled in mechanical engineering at 18, with a particular interest in robotics and autonomous systems that Jordan had watched develop over years of Saturday afternoons in the facility and evenings at the kitchen table, and long conversations in the truck on the way to and from places, conversations in which she asked the kinds of questions that required him to think carefully before answering, and that occasionally led him to revise a position he had held for years. She came home on breaks to argue with him about design decisions, with an intensity and a specificity he found deeply satisfying, the way a person finds it satisfying when someone they have taught surpasses them in a way that is recognizable as a continuation of what was taught, rather than a departure from it. She was better than him in several areas already. He told her so, plainly. She told him he was being modest, also plainly. They were probably both right, and neither of them required the question to be settled in order to enjoy having it between them. The anniversary celebration was held on the factory floor of the Harrison campus, arranged by the workers themselves rather than by an event company, which meant it was decorated with opinions and the results of several strong disagreements about the placement of lighting, and it was exactly right. Jordan spent most of the evening at the back of the room where the sightlines were good, and the temperature was cool, and you could see the whole thing at once without being required to be at the center of it. Emma spoke from the podium with her mother's steady eyes and her father's directness. And she told the crowd that what she had learned from watching her father build this company was not, strictly speaking, learned from watching him succeed. It was learned from watching him fail, and try again, and fail differently, and try again, and slowly, over years, stop failing in the ways he had been failing, and begin failing in new and more interesting ways that were closer to the edge of what he was ultimately trying to reach. That the not failing took a long time, and looked very much like failing while it was happening. And the only way through the failing parts was to stay in them without surrendering to them, which is a different skill from courage, and a harder one to teach, and her father had taught her not by explaining it but by doing it in front of her for her entire childhood. Victoria Harrison was in the room that evening, standing near the side wall during Emma's speech, with the expression of someone witnessing something genuinely good that they had, by their own choices, nearly prevented from existing. It is not a comfortable experience. It is a useful one. She had built a small advisory practice by then, focused on manufacturing culture and the retention of technical expertise, working with companies that were in the early stages of making the mistakes Harrison Industries had made and trying to help them understand the cost of those mistakes before they were paid rather than after. She mentioned it to Jordan briefly during the evening with a kind of careful, genuine humility, not performed, not strategic, but the actual version, which is quieter and more expensive to maintain. Jordan told her it sounded like important work. And he meant it. Because the work of preventing the next Harrison Industries from becoming what Harrison Industries had become was in fact important work, and he was not a man who said things he did not mean to spare people's feelings. Jordan Price stood on the upper walkway of the R&D wing later that evening, after the last cars had left the parking lot and the building had settled into its nighttime rhythm, the particular quality of quiet that a place acquires when the people who animate it have gone home, and what remains is the residue of their presence, the warmth of recently used machinery, the small indicators still lit on the control panels, the faint smell of metal and coolant that Jordan had breathed in one form or another for the entirety of his adult working life, and that he associated, at a level below thought, with the fundamental rightness of being in a place where things were made. Below him, the factory floor hummed its complex chord, the specific, layered sound of well-maintained machines operated by people who know what they are doing and why it matters, a sound that is not music exactly but contains what music contains when it is working. A sense of ordered vitality, of multiple elements in relationship, or of things doing precisely what they are meant to do in the precise relationship to one another, that makes the whole function as a system rather than a collection of parts. He had been trying, standing there, to identify the single thing that had made all of this possible, and he kept arriving at the same accurate and slightly deflating answer. There was no single thing. There was Diane, and what she had been, and what losing her had required of him and Emma, both the grief and the responsibility arriving together in a package he had not chosen and had learned, over months and years, to carry with a kind of dignity that he hoped Emma would remember not as bravery but as ordinary love, doing what ordinary love does when it has no alternative but to continue. There was Emma and the red tin with $47 in it, and the folder of drawings, now very thick, still on the shelf above the workbench in the Mercer Road facility, that he had kept as a secondary workspace even after the move, partly for practical reasons, and partly because it was the place where the whole thing had started, and he did not think it was wise to lose track of where things started. There was Gary Kowalski calling back with a complaint, and thereby starting a relationship. There was Dana Park's extraordinary attention to quality and her capacity for designing systems that other people could actually use. There was Lou Ferretti's hands and Terrence Mill's intuition and the 219 people who had come back through those doors and brought their knowledge with them. There was the long, unglamorous work of nights in the garage. Failed prototypes, recalculated tolerances, the unit that failed under stress testing, and the drive to Gary's shop to look at it directly rather than from a distance. There was the particular education that comes from staying with a problem long enough to find the thing that everyone else has missed, which is an education available only to people who are willing to stay, and which Jordan had been accumulating since he was a young man on a factory floor who did not yet know what he was accumulating or what it would eventually be worth. And yes, because honest accounting required it. And because Jordan was a man who believed in honest accounting above all other kinds, there was a conference room on the 14th floor, and a woman who had been looking at her tablet, and 4 words spoken with the smooth finality of executive authority, into a room full of colleagues and witnesses. Words that had sent him out into an afternoon that felt entirely, completely, and convincingly like an ending. The fact that it had turned out to be the beginning of the only story worth telling was not something he could have predicted in the parking garage during those 11 minutes. It was something that had emerged from the compound effect of 11 minutes plus 6 weeks plus 14 months plus years and years of choosing, each day, to continue rather than to stop. He was not a man who believed the universe arranged things according to intention or plan. He was too much of an engineer for that kind of thinking. He understood causality too well to mistake it for design, understood that what looks like fate in retrospect is generally the accumulated consequence of decisions made, without the benefit of knowing how they would eventually connect. But he did believe, based on the specific and concrete evidence of his own life, that a person who refuses to stop is a person the future has no practical choice but to accommodate. That the world eventually runs out of ways to tell a persistent, principled, skilled person that they are finished. Not because the world becomes kind or just or aligned with that person's interests, but because the person, by continuing to develop and apply and build and refine and insist, eventually becomes something that the world cannot afford to ignore. Below him, the factory hummed its complex, layered chord. Above him, the stars performed their indifferent and ancient function without requesting acknowledgement for it. Jordan Price stood in the amber light of what he had built: the machines, the work, the people, the future being quietly assembled in every direction by hands that knew what they were doing, and minds that had been given the conditions necessary to do it well and felt, for a long and uncomplicated moment, the satisfaction of a man who had stayed in the room with the hard problem and had not left it until it was solved. He turned from the railing and went back to work.